All right, think about this. What if you could grow your art, promote it, and grow your audience all on your own? No waiting for a manager, no big budgets, just you, your skills, and a plan. In 2025, being a self-sufficient artist isn't just an option, it's the game changer. Let me show you how. Hi everyone, welcome to week 1 of our journey into becoming a self-sufficient artist in 2025. You can call me Wharf, and if you're here, you're probably an artist who's ready to take your craft and your career into your own hands. Each week, I'm going to do my best to help you succeed as an artist in today's world. Whether you're a musician, whether you're a photographer, a painter, or any kind of creative, this series is all about equipping you with the skills, mindset, and tools to thrive in a very, very difficult industry. Let's talk about why self-sufficiency is so important in 2025. We're living in a time when technology and social media give artists an unprecedented ability to share their work with the world. In fact, the playing field has been completely and totally leveled. But it also means you're competing with millions of others for attention. The old ways of relying on managers or waiting for someone to discover you aren't enough anymore. To stand out, you have to be more than just an artist. You need to be a marketer, a content creator, a brand strategist, and in many cases, your own production team. It sounds like a lot, and realistically, it is. But here's the good news, you can learn these skills. And when you do, you'll have the freedom to take full control over your career. So, what does it take to be a self-sufficient artist in 2025? Here's a sneak peek of what I'll cover. Number 1, building your personal brand. You'll learn how to define your unique voice, your style, and a clear message, and make sure it's consistent across everything you do, from your social media to your album covers and even your website. We'll dive into content creation mastery. We'll dive into photography, videography, and editing basics. You'll learn how to shoot professional looking photos and videos on different budgets and create engaging content that tells your unique story. Marketing and social media strategy. I'll teach you how to make platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube work for you. We'll talk about algorithm hacks, content planning, and building an engaged community. We'll talk about music and visual production. If you're a musician like me, you'll learn about self-producing and engineering your tracks, recording, and even creating your own music videos from the ground up. We'll talk about time management and workflow optimization, because juggling all these roles can be extremely overwhelming. I'll share tips on helping you stay organized, prioritizing tasks, and making time for what matters most, your art. So here's the thing. Being self-sufficient isn't just about saving money or avoiding middlemen. It's about freedom. When you have the skills to create, market, and share your art on your own terms, you're no longer at the mercy of algorithms or gatekeepers. You're in total control. And trust me, I know what it's like to start from scratch. 15 years ago, I couldn't afford to hire people to help me with my music career, so I took it upon myself to start teaching myself everything I needed to know, like graphic art, videography, photography, even website development. It wasn't easy, but it gave me the tools to build my brand and also help others along the way. So, with all that being said, over the course of 2025, I'm going to share everything I've learned with you. By the end of this series, you'll not only have a better understanding of what it takes to succeed as an artist, but you'll also have actionable skills you can start using right away. So let's get started. Make sure to subscribe, follow along, and feel free to drop any questions or comments below. Together, we're going to turn your artistic vision into a reality.